Welcome to Exopolitical Diplomacy, right? Commander Runningcloud's log, okay? Exopolitical diplomacy means that a lot of my conversations are to educate beings not from this planet. Yes, that's right. To educate beings not from this planet to let them know the insider accounts, pretty much like an anthropological informant, a participant observer. That's my role. That's why that's the name of this particular show that the Running Cloud group is producing. And Commander Running Cloud's log is representative of my wish to one day work for Star Trek, traveling, the galaxy to other planets where the people are oppressed like we, to help liberate them using all of the means available to us. Now, yesterday when I spoke to you, I meant to talk more about church, but it was 2 hours and I was tired, but I had to do the backstory, right? Well, because I talked about the attacks on me last night, I had a pretty good sleep. As you can see, I look better, I look healthier, and I feel better too. But I'm still, dealing with numbness in my face and other things like that. So there's no cure yet for the infections I've been given. By the time I finish the backstory, often my time is up and I don't actually get to talk about my major topic. And that happened yesterday. Yesterday, when I started talking about church, I only talked about church in terms of the way it's infiltrated in my experiences today. But of course, I don't ever want you to think that I believe that all Europeans are scheming after American property. I don't. I think most Europeans aren't even aware of what we're dealing with. And when they become aware, they become angry and defensive. Anytime you're accusing someone of heinous crimes against you personally, they're going to be defensive and hostile, especially if they're not willing to give up the behavior because it's too beneficial and profitable for them. So I want to start talking about the importance of church. And I'm going to talk about the importance of religion. Now, when my children were in Amity school system there in Woodbridge, Connecticut, one of the courses that one of my children took, had them reading the history of the Bible. And I'd never read this before, but I had to read it to help my child write a term paper. I had to learn the material myself so I could edit her work. And what I learned was that the Bible wasn't written for 300 years after Jesus died, that Jesus was Middle Eastern, not European, didn't look European at all, that the Bible was created, the most popular one was created by Constantine, who I think was in Turkey in the Ottoman Empire. And the reason it was written was for political purposes and to create a mind control, a way to influence people, a way to make people docile and obedient and a part of a hierarchy defined by religion. Now, there were a lot of wars based on religion back then in Europe because religion was a political weapon. Blood libel is the process of controlling the public discourse, people's minds, what they say, what they deem important, what they don't deem important. Blood libel is a form of social intelligence. You know how spies say we're gathering intelligence? Because knowledge is wisdom, right? So the more information you're gathering, the more aware you are of what's happening, what other people are doing, and what's going on in your environment, right? So intelligence is important. Manipulating intelligence is the purpose of blood libel. Controlling what information gets out, controlling the attitude of the people towards it, and pretty much telling people what to think. Now, the reason why processes like blood libel work is because once people get the sense of the ideology, you don't have to tell them specifically how to behave or what to do because you've installed the template, right? You created the paradigm when this, if this, then this, otherwise this, right? You've created the template for their thinking. So their critical thinking will follow certain lines. Now, the reason why I bring up blood libel along with the history of religion is because somehow in America, Americans that go to church and read the Bible came to believe that Jesus was a Jew, like a Jew you'd see in Brooklyn, when Jesus looked more like a Palestinian than a European. Okay? Now that's important because when we look at church in America and religion in America, we have to see how it's used to determine certain thoughts we have and to determine mind control. If we are here, we Americans, the red, the black, the yellow ones, the brown ones, the ones of us that were here before the European campaign for our land and our assets began, we had religion then too, right? We had shaman, we had belief systems, we had traditions of how the world came to be. But one thing that we all had kind of automatically was a sense of morality. We didn't need Moses to tell us not to steal because we knew from being robbed and being robbers that stealing causes people pain. And pain makes people act out in very negative ways. And pain hurts. And every living creature wants to avoid hurting, avoid pain, except, for sickos that are sadists and masochists, they seek out pain. But for someone with what I consider a normal psychological profile, the avoidance of pain is a distinct motivator. You don't want to feel pain from hunger. You don't want to feel pain from heat. You don't want to feel pain from cold. Most of the things that we've invented have to do with alleviating physical and mental pain from our lives. Now, somehow in America, we all came to believe that Jesus Christ looks like a European man and European man. And so it makes us feel obliged to people that look like that. Now, if you add into that myths of slavery, that none of us were here, the myth of slavery starts with the premise that America was empty country. Nobody lived here. It was just abundance, right? And just a few tribes of nomadic people were living here. But for the most part, when we look at the stories and the way that we believe and the premises that we start with, we think America was empty, right? And that the Europeans brought over everybody that's black. Everybody that's black was brought over here from Africa by the Europeans. But all we have to do is talk to our families, our elders. I mean, that's what I did. You know, we can only go so far back, um, but we know what's true, right? I mean, the truth resonates, doesn't it? When you kind of feel like, ding, well, that was true. and you hold on to it. Well, anyone that does enough scratching you can listen to Kermeo. Golly, what is his name? What is his name? He reads from books. Okay, I'll put his name out at some point in time. He's a guy that reads from books about the history of Native peoples in America, what real Americans really looked like, what tribes were here, and he really provides the proof that we were already here. We were already here when the Europeans got here. They didn't invent Black Americans by bringing Africans over here. But if you believe that the only reason you're in America is because Europeans brought you here, and you believe that Jesus was a European and not an Arab Jew, if you believe those things, then your attitude towards Europeans in America is very different. You're not so willing to fight for what you see as your right to your property. You're not even likely to see it as your property because you're obliged to people that have presented themselves as being your source. Your ontological moment is European. Now, the man I'm talking about is Kurameo Ahu. That's Curimeoahau. And Kurameo Ahu is a scholar. And I think he's living in Costa Rica right now. But he retrieves and reads publications that precede the blood libel stories that we're all told that form our sense of identity. When I was at Northwestern University, a lot of the American kids that were there had to struggle with the idea that they were intellectually inferior to the Europeans there. I had to do the same thing, especially when one of the Europeans told me that I was intellectually inferior and only there because of affirmative action. But the grades I was getting were making me wonder that too. But fortunately for me, when I lived in Canada, I was able to compete in a more fair arena, and my grades were good there. I had a lot of B's, a few A's, and theirs was a more advanced curriculum. So I had the proof in my own life experience that the Europeans were not smarter than me. And I also had the proof in my own experience of going to school in a ghetto in DC and in New York City and going to a private elite school in Toronto and a public school in Ontario and Saskatchewan. So I had a lot of experience, firsthand experience, actually being there and being able to see exactly what I'm being taught. For example, I went to a school in Washington, D.C. that was built over our playground. We had a creek and there were toads in that creek, and we had put one of our parents had put a tire swing in that creek, and that creek was our recreational place to go. And the city planners, Europeans, decided to take that water and turn that land into a school. And they built the Gladys K. Magogny School. I went to, I think, grade 6 there. I guess I was 10. At that school, the maps that we had on the wall were very different from the maps that I found on the wall when I moved that year to Ontario. The maps on the wall in the American school in DC had Canada as a blank, just a big blank. So we would look at the map which was always present, and we would see the United States and the 13 colonies all in one color, and the other parts of the map made out to us, the Louisiana Purchase, whatever map we were looking at. But whatever map we were looking at, North America was pretty much erased. The world was pretty much erased, and all we saw were the North America known as the United States. Not the United States Corporation, but the continental United States. So we're looking at this map, and I keep looking at the empty space and saying, well, that must be undiscovered land. That must be empty land. That must be land that America has not yet developed. And that's what I thought. I thought that everything north of Maine, north of Wisconsin, north of the Dakotas, north of Minnesota, everything north of Washington State was undeveloped land that we had yet to develop, because in my mind had been created the image that until the Europeans got here, there was nothing here but empty land, right? Only back then, we were the Americans, so we didn't know about race. We were just in grade 6. So when someone said the Americans, we felt included in that definition. We felt they were talking about us. So we felt we just haven't gotten there yet, right? Now that does a couple of things. It gives you a sense of the great possibility your future can hold as you move into the undiscovered lands of Canada, right? So it can feed your sense of adventure, your sense of ambition, your sense of going out to find my fortune, right? But on the other hand, it masks the reality that the Iroquois, the Huron, the Oneida, the what's the name of that biggest tribe in Canada? I can't remember the name of one of the biggest tribes in Canada. And it slips my mind often. But anyway, we didn't really recognize that anybody had lived there. Now, when I went to Canada, the focus was on the European invasion and the way that the Iroquois and Huron Indians worked with the Europeans. And we learned about the Dutch and their trading company and how the Indians used to trade pelts, animal pelts, for cooking pots and other things like that that the Europeans had gotten through their imperialist trade routes. And yeah, the India Dutch Company, something like that. We heard about everything about how the St. Lawrence Seaway was discovered and explored by the Europeans, about Champlain and St. Laurent, I guess. I don't know the names. I can't remember. Grade 6 was a super long time ago. Grades 5 and 6 and 7 that I did there in Canada. Yeah, I think it was 6 and 7. Anyway, there we learned about the Europeans in Europe and not so much about the Eskimos and the Aleut, Aleut, the Aleut people in the Northwest Territories. We knew a little bit about the Eskimos, from National Geographic magazine that my mother always had a subscription to. We learned about these other races of people, but it didn't really congeal because we didn't talk about it in school. In Canada, in the European school system, they talked about their heroes that invaded the land and the alliances with the native people who maybe had some infighting. And when the Europeans said, hey, we'll give you guns, just give us access to this land. And the First Nations people are presented as cooperating with the Europeans instead of resisting them. Whereas in the United States, when they talked about European manifest destiny, it was presented as contentious, cowboys and Indians, the Oregon Trail stagecoaches that would move through and invade, and the fear that the Europeans had of being burned off the land by the people fighting to maintain their autonomy. They don't present it as a resistance, they present it as the heroic Europeans being attacked by savages. Well, Curamayo's work and the work of others that I've talked about, that I can't recall right now because I'm trying to stay on the topic of church without getting too carried away. You know, when you're trained to do 3-hour lectures as a college professor, uh, graduate student college professor, you don't exactly know when to shut up and stop the trail of thought completely. So I'm going to keep this focused on church, okay? But the point I'm trying to make is that we were already here and that slavery was a wraparound system. Much like I go to the John F. Kennedy Hospital in need in Indio, in need of immediate medical care, and they wrap a system of oppression around me. And I come out of there owing money, not being able to get a bill, not being able to get access to my medical records. In fact, they didn't even let me see a doctor. But when I look on the electronic records stored online, violating my HIPAA rights completely, but they had me give my HIPAA rights away, right? Now, I'd already been seen, so I could have just walked out of there and not done the electronics. But when you're a person that perceives yourself as obedient and law abiding and good, it's hard not to respect authority, even when authority is corporate greed disguised as morality. So, just as the medical industry is wrapping us into a system of total oppression and helplessness, right? COVID is one example of their success when the medical profession acts as one and punishes anybody that presents a divergent point of view about COVID. And they were shut down, weren't they? They were shut down completely. They were punished. They were even murdered. And scientific exploration was strongly discouraged because there was a political agenda, right? But we had been wrapped around in a system that made us increasingly more helpless to the point where when they actually do the climatic event to show how deaf, how dumb, and how blind they've made us, we don't even try to resist because we've already learned resistance is futile, right? From Doctor Who and those villainous, um, were they the Borg? Those cube beings that were taking over consciousness and turning it into a group collective, and they would say the Daleks, it's the Daleks, this one. Resistance is futile, right? So we'd already learned, as all of the automated customer service systems are teaching us, the resistance is futile. You think you're going to do a direct US Treasury transaction through the hospital or the mortgage company, as the Europeans teaching um, in the sovereignty movement? They contest their titles, but the people that are teaching you how the economic system is working against you with your own consent, and they're letting you know what the real statutes and laws are, men like Brandon Joe Williams and Christopher Hauser, who are teaching people just how they've been screwed, just how they've been deceived, just how the system of blood libel has made it seem like there's nothing else they can do. Exactly how the maze has been placed around the rats. And we're the rats in that analogy, right? And when we try to find our way out, we find ourselves in a maze with predetermined endpoints, with predetermined dead ends, with predetermined routes. And that's where they hold us, and no way out. So it's a labyrinthine maze that we find ourselves in, where each route that we're funneled into gets closed off, right? So, during the myth of slavery, the way that they really made the lie work was by creating laws and government agencies that treated free landowning Americans like slaves. So they weren't slaves because the Europeans brought them here in their rickety little wooden boats. They weren't slaves because they were born lower on the totem pole. They were slaves because the Europeans said, blood libel mind fuck. Make the free landing people feel inferior, feel like they don't have the right to fight because none of this is their stuff. Right? Now, once you've defined that as your goal, that you're going to make an entire people feel worthless and inferior, there are many ways that you can go about it. And that's why I bring up blood libel, because blood libel was a very multi-pronged psychological attack that uses social institutions to accomplish the goal of politically disempowering people and creating a mass consciousness that demands things that the authorities want you to demand based on the lies and deceptions and the paradigms they've implanted. Okay? Am I doing all right here? What I'm saying is that in 1100 AD in Europe, after the 300 AD creation of the Bible and the Gutenberg press that let people distribute copies of the Bible to a more literate culture, more and more literate culture. They want their own, they want to read it for themselves. Well, the Gutenberg press was created and it allowed printing and distribution of what the enemies of landowners wanted their victims to know. So the reason I bring up blood libel is because blood libel was created in 1100 and imported to America, already tested, all the strategies already tested, all the goals already tested, all the objectives already tested, and it was inserted here with just different variables, right? That would make it work, that would make people unquestioningly bow to the idea of a hierarchy, of an imposed hierarchy, because that's what the Bible was designed to achieve. Now, like every psychopathic act, every psychopathic movement, there's good along with the bad, because if you don't have enough good, you're not going to sell it. Okay, you got to have enough good to really sell your product, right? So they presented to us Jesus, but then they gave us a picture of Jesus, and they made Jesus look like our enemies, like the people that want to steal our land. So that every time we want to resist them, something holds us back. Something holds us back because we love Jesus. And we don't love Jesus because he was created by Constantine and a committee of Europeans that decided what stories to put in and create the canonical text, which scrolls that scribes had written, like Paul and Saul and Isaac and John. All those scribes had written things and they went through them, right? And they changed the language sometimes to create certain effects, certain idioms, linguistic systems. But the reason that we all love Jesus so much, the idea of Jesus, the idea that we can personify and anthropomorphize Jesus, makes us feel connected, like Jesus is in a human body, just like ourselves. And what Jesus brought to us was the feeling that you should always operate from a position of love and caring. You should try to feed people that are hungry, provide shelter for people that are homeless, provide healing for people that are ill, provide water or wine. No, I'm not, big wine, I don't drink, but water or wine, right? Water. You should always love your neighbor as you love yourself, right? And we're assuming that we're all healthy and loving ourselves and wanting to live and wanting to keep ourselves clean and healthy and well fed and happy and motivated with a sense of purpose, goals, and achievements, because those are very important to human beings, right? And what else is important to human beings is a social context, a society to live in. Just like bees are social insects and they do little bee dances and they can track previous dances in midair. You don't even have to be there to follow the bee path in the air if you're a bee. Just like ants are social creatures, they work together, they have a structure, they have a hierarchy. Every ant has a job, something to do. You've got the ants that are scouts that go out looking to see what's around and they're able to communicate back to the hive, right? And just like ants and bees, just like monkeys and gorillas and orangutans, just like horses and cows and lambs and sheep, just like goats and chickens and doves, we human beings of Earth survive in a social context. We want a society like ourselves. And when I say like ourselves, I don't mean you have to think the same. I just mean you have to be human beings, right? Now, at this point, I just want to remind people that I do not hate Europeans and that any European American by nationality whenever they want to. But it does require a mindset that you believe everybody living here has a right to happiness, has a right to pursue their goals, has a right to make a fortune. Okay? And when you die, you can pass it on to your heirs. And if your heirs don't want it and they prefer to start from scratch, well, all your stuff can go back into the barrel for somebody else to take. You see, building empires over generations, that's because those people that believe that way are at war with us, the landowners, by nature, the landowners by God, the landowners by this being our native lands, the lands where we were sprung from, the lands where the dust is formed by the rotted bones of our ancestors. This is our land, right? So, religion in Europe was used to deprive people of any sense of fight, any sense of entitlement, and make them feel in a hierarchy under the Pope, under the Cardinal, under the Archbishop. They created an entire hierarchy of power using the Bible and religion. Okay? So the Bible comes to America. The Bible goes everywhere, right? They called it civilizing the savages. But what's more savage than robbing and killing people to make your living? What's more savage than a race of people that travel the world robbing, murdering, and creating institutions to achieve that? So the church, when it came to America, was always designed to be control system, right? But we found the teachings of the Bible in harmony with our own belief systems, that you shouldn't steal because it hurts people and you don't want to hurt people. It hurts us to see other people cry because we have compassion and empathy, because we knew the value of love for each other. Okay? And when you're living in a land of abundance where you can just walk to a more fertile land if you want to, where there's plenty of land around for all of us, plenty of food, plenty of sunshine, plenty of fresh air, plenty of places to build your home. When you're living like that, you don't have as much internal strife, right? It's not so much like a game of musical chairs where someone is going to be left out and out of the game. There's enough for everyone, right? And this is a big planet, people. There's enough for everyone here. There's enough for everyone. You know, in the South, when my people were farming there in our tribes, there was always an abundance of food in the American South. It was a great growing zone. The Midwest of this continent, tons of places to grow food, tons. And all those potteries that you see, well, they stored food. You put a little wax, a little paraffin on top of one of those potteries, and you've got an airtight, vacuum sealed container for storing your grains, for storing your rices. And you get a root cellar for storing your onions and your potatoes and your sweet potatoes and your yams and your cassavas and your watermelons and your oranges and your grapefruits. I mean, my goodness, on American land, you can grow anything you want somewhere. And so we have fed the world in some places, in some cases, in some supply chain scenarios. But we have been robbed of the ability to feed ourselves. Well, this conversation is about church. And the reason I had to talk about slavery and define slavery as a myth is because I have to start the conversation about church, what I want to bring out about church in slavery times. As the Europeans moved in and became more oppressive on the Black land-owning farmers and became more aggressive about taking over their lands, not really winning their minds over, saying, well, you used to be slaves, because you knew you didn't used to be a slave. You knew that your grandmother, your great-grandmother, her mother, as long as you can trace your heritage, you know that you've been on this land. So they can't come to you and tell that lie. They can't tell that lie until the ancestors are dead and they have a public education system doing blood libel. Okay, so you see why I had to define all these terms before I really get into it? So church was one of the places that were allowed for American people to congregate, to meet. They could meet under worship. The Europeans put laws and restrictions and punishments around dancing, around talking in public spaces, on meetings and parties, on places you might go drinking and partying, you know, clubs. The Europeans controlled social interactions because they knew from blood libel, from creating blood libel, the science of blood libel, they knew how powerful it could be as a resistance and a social control when you have people actually sharing their intelligence, sharing their experiences, sharing their knowledge. So churches were allowed, right? But I suppose with infiltrators, which persist to this day in the Black churches, in American churches. Not all of them, probably. Not all of them, perhaps. But the ones that I've been to in this day and age. So you don't have a private place to talk, right? Now, if you talk too much in Jim Crow, you'll end up lynched. You'll end up hanging from a tree if you share too much of your intelligence, because this intelligence is dangerous. Because if I tell you Judge Butner stole my land in Oklahoma and they set out a trap for me that I can't go to Oklahoma or they're going to capture me using the police force. If I tell you that and you are in Oklahoma, well, then you know something about your land and about the way the world is functioning around you that you didn't know before. You suddenly understand why your town of Lima is not being repaired. You suddenly understand why your town of Lima is being poached on by the Europeans and East Indians in the Oklahoma DOT. Once you know that you inherited land in the South, but you couldn't get it because you didn't know how, and you didn't have enough money in your northern job to be able to get the lawyers, to make the trips, to stay in the hotels, to do the research. You couldn't get your land. So it's considered abandoned, and the Europeans can take it. Don't you think that that was the plan when the Ku Klux Klan drove everybody off their land? Whether the Ku Klux Klan wore the costume or not, for the purposes of my talk, of my discourse, the Ku Klux Klan is any European that uses terrorism to steal and kill Americans, real Americans, the ones with heritages that pre exist the European invasion and takeover that we've been exposed to for thousands of years now. A 1,000-year war. Well, it's not unheard of. And look at the gains they've made. But each generation has a new level unfolding around us, imprisoning us, tying our arms, taking away our property. They didn't take the land directly from B.H. Deck. No, no, they didn't. They drove his son off. They drove his daughters off, but they kept the land in a trust. And when it got to me, Bose, Carl, Silver Rain, Runningcloud, but you have to put my daddy in there. So Bose, Carl, Severn, Silver Rain. Okay, 4 generations out, they don't even have to pretend that they're not stealing my land from me. They don't even have to pretend. They don't even have to drive me off with Ku Klux Klanmen in costumes or not. They don't have to do anything but use the law and the courts and the government because they have invaded just that much that they can kidnap me, put me in jail, have all my rights, and call me a citizen, right? And we know from Brandon Joe and Christopher and Mark Christopher, who I saw and learned from before them, he's an East Indian British, who, with the postal, his whole angle is the postal system being autonomous from the Europeans by design and having powers beyond theirs, separate powers. Um, and she's trying to rise up with a postal justice system to liberate humanity from the European and the threats. So from all these men, we learn that if you're a citizen, it means that you belong as an employee to the United States of America Corporation. If you have a birth certificate, BERTH, BIRTH, conflate them. It means you're in the maritime law system, which is the ships of Britain, right? That the Royal Navy of England was renowned for savagery, for floating up to a land and settling and making ports that are privately owned and controlled, and then stealing the property from the people and shipping it out on their ships, and then sending soldiers in, right? You remember that guy in American history who says the British are coming? Paul Revere from New England, right? The British are coming, the British are coming, and the Boston Tea Party and all of that. Those were Europeans fighting each other. They weren't fighting for America. They were fighting to stop paying British royalty. But what happened was the royals just moved over here and became citizens, right? With powers and rights of citizens, backed up by the warriors that could come across the sea in boats. Did you hear that Starlink has military grade software? You might know that the Starlink company didn't ask for anyone's permission to install satellites all over the planet with access to every corner of this planet. Don't you think that's invasive? Don't you think that if you've got an enemy with satellites over your head, that he can do whatever he pleases because he can zap you? He can microwave you from outer space where you can't reach them. Well, the sea was kind of like that, that they could run in, murder your people, steal their stuff, and run back out on their ships. So maritime law became a governing law in America, right? And we've been told that the United States of America is really geographically just Washington, D.C. Ironically enough, a guy named Lafayette, who was an American, did the layout for Washington, D.C. He laid out the city of Washington, D.C. Now, when the Europeans pretend they invented this world, they don't tell you that. They don't tell you De La Salle was also an American who mapped out Chicago and built Chicago on a swamp. They don't tell you that. They don't tell you that DC was founded by an American, that Chicago was founded by American. They don't even tell you that the first president of America was an American, not a European. They start counting at George Washington, the first European president. And they tell us, well, all those presidents were slave owners. Well, maybe they were, but they probably were the only ones. That's probably why they had so much political power and wealth, because much like Elon Musk can do whatever he wants to, while the rest of us are rendered helpless and powerless and unable to fulfill our goals, just like somehow he has invisible access to get whatever he wants, whatever power acquisition he wants, so did these European presidents. But slavery was not the norm. If you're able to ever get a hold of John Blassingame's accounts from the Smithsonian Institute's slave narratives, quote unquote, you'll find how many Americans had no idea that the Europeans thought of them as slaves. They were just living their best life, right? Oh, the material conditions weren't luxurious, but you should see the material conditions over in Europe during the same time. People were starving. People were throwing their urine out on the heads of people in the street because they didn't have indoor toilets, and there was so much urbanization that they didn't have a countryside like they did in India, where all the women could use the toilet in a field dedicated for that because there was plenty of land. But not in Europe. In Europe, there's plenty of cities. So people took their chamber pots and just dumped them on the street. I don't know what they did with their poops. I really don't. I just know that I heard that the groom of the stool was the closest power to the queens and kings of England, because the groom of the stool had a chamber pot to collect the feces of the royals. And then they kept those feces in a chamber of feces. And the groom of the stool was in charge of the feces collection and washing the anuses of the royals and storing the poops, probably cataloging them in the catacombs. And this was somebody's job. And this person was considered, in fact, Princess Diana's father was a groom of the stool. And that's why she was in line to become a princess, because the groom of the stool, being so intimate with the royals, had a lot of influence over the decisions that the royals made. And the people knew this. Now imagine that you're a peasant. Okay? Now we constantly want to remind Americans of the myth of slavery, but we seldom want to remind Europeans that they're all peasants and only a handful of them are royals, and that in their system they are peasants and serfs. But let's say that you're a peasant back in England and you've got the groom of the stool collecting the queen's poop, and your taxes are so many chickens and so many lambs and so many cows from Ireland, because you're feeding these royals. They're making you feed them. And if you don't feed them, they'll bring their revenuers out. They'll bring their taxmen out with the army, and they will kill you or put you in a debtor's prison. And I want you to remember that structure and look at the structure we're living under now and see the similarities in that, how we are all being treated like European peasants from medieval Europe, medieval England, and we are all being deprived of our power to control the land. Now, in Europe, they had to use power to control the land because there's not enough land in Europe for as many Europeans as wish to exist in this day and time or any other day and time. Not enough resources, not enough land. So the church and the Bible were designed to include enough good stuff in it for good people to believe in it, but enough deception in it to keep imperialism, colonialism, robbery, genocide, and theft alive. Okay? During the Jim Crow days, the church became one of the only places where American people could talk freely. Okay? You could talk freely in your home, but if too many people came to your home, the Ku Klux Klan would burn your home down and hang your men and women. So people were trained to fear conversations about resistance, to fear sharing intelligence about the ways that the enemies are executing attacks, the ways the enemies are taking over the lands, the way the enemies are creating multi-generations under the threat of genocide. If you're able to share that information, you can come up with strategies to protect yourself, right? Now, the Europeans, they have the Rotary Club, they have the Knights of Columbus, they have the Sons of Italy, they've got the Mizell Center in Palm Springs, California, they've got their gated communities, they've got their golf courses, they've got their country clubs, they've got their tennis clubs, they've got their pickleball clubs, whatever the heck pickleball is, right? Europeans have created so many places where they can actually talk in complete privacy and talk about how they're going to target individuals like me, how they're going to actually make it work. The sense of the paradigm, even the people not in those clubs know exactly how to act. That if you're a European and you see another European challenge me to walk down the aisle of an airplane and pick a big fight with me, then all you other Europeans know to come out and say, hey, we vouch for the European. This American is wrong. Yes, she was assaulted. She says she was assaulted and battered by a European man. Oh, that's a lie, officer. That's a lie, Officer Blackie, right? Because they always put your own people in and pay them. And maybe they're not smart enough, but sometimes they look so happy to be hurting their own people that you just remember the myth of slavery includes the overseer, a very real person in the context, and that the overseer was the person of the same race, the same tribe that worked for the Europeans. African writer, Igbo, Nigeria, writer Chinua Achebe. I forgot to mention yesterday that I read a lot of African literature and translation too, a lot. And Chinua Achebe was one of the African writers that I read when I studied with Leon Forrest. We read Arrow of God. Um, So on my own, I read Things Fall Apart and other novels by Chinua Achebe. And then I learned that Chinua Achebe was a statesman, became a statesman, traveled, a politician because he understood so much about what was happening. Well, he brought up and taught me this. He said, the one way that the Europeans made headway into the African tribes was by finding the outsiders, the ones that were rejected for one reason or another, and then taking them into the church and making them leaders of the church. And then they borrow the glory of Jesus and the Bible and the European hierarchy of religion, and they are seen in greater esteem because of the European church giving them power and influence through the association, the relationship. But that these people generally hated their own people for the way that they had been ostracized and excluded, and the ways that they were already misfits in the culture, and powerful enemies on the inside. Well, that same kind of war strategy was used with here in America. When you see the black cops that will beat in the head of a black man, or the black cops working on the Dan Ryan, while they know that speeders are speeding twice as fast on the Edens. But Lakeshore Drive and the Dan Ryan go through American communities and neighborhoods, while the Edens go into the suburbs controlled by Europeans fiercely. Europeans like Sheldon L. Epstein, who told me about covenant, exclude purchasing homes legally, exclude. Didn't matter that there were federal laws preventing housing discrimination. That didn't matter at all, because a business transaction between one private party and another's really didn't come under government scrutiny. As long as you're an insider and they're selling to you and it's all right, you're not going to say, "Hey, I'm a Christian. You can't give me this privilege and exclude my neighbor, the original landowner. You've got to do something for them." Well, you're not going to find that. You're not going to find people in a position of privilege representing the interests of the people being deprived, right? In a system like that, in a system of binaries where you've got winners, losers, blacks, whites, rich, poor. When you've got a system of extreme binary polarity as the foundation, right? Because once you've decided that the skins are going to win and the skins are all European and you got to have European skin to be on the team, then you pretty much set a binary opposition in motion, which is what Heidegger, the German scholar, taught everybody. Was it Heidegger or Hegel? Oh, Hegel, the Hegelian opposition, the binary opposition. Okay, so the church was the only place where American people could actually talk about the experience of European nationalist racism. And once you talk about it, you can actually create strategies to protect yourself and defend your land. So, in accordance with blood libel science, that is not going to happen. If your enemies get the chance to actually have strategies against you, you could lose, right? And one thing we learned is that when you're willing to kill and steal for your economic system, you don't plan to lose. You plan to win by any means necessary. There will be no moral stops. There will be no conscience. There will be no sense of karma, because your only purpose is to win, to conquer, to make the other concede rights, property, even the gift of their humanity. So churches were where Dr. Martin Luther King came from, right? And they made such a big deal about Dr. Martin Luther King because they knew that it was going to end with him, that organized protests from Americans was squashed with Dr. Martin Luther King. So they present him as a hero, even though he won us nothing. They present him as a hero, much like if Custer won a huge battle against Western prairie Indian tribes. He lost a huge battle. Now, what if we made Custer the most admired man among Europeans? What will we be telling them? We would be telling them resistance is futile. Look at your greatest one. Your greatest one is the biggest loser on the planet. And we're going to make statues and schools and streets. We're going to remind you every day what will happen to you if you rise up. And there was no, and they had a BLM like force of non insiders destroy the communities. Chicago South Side still has not recovered from the destruction of Chatham, the destruction of South Shore, the destruction of Grand Rising, Grand Crossing, utter destruction of properties. Properties that belonged to European investors that took tax write-offs, right? Because they own the tax system, so they can make whatever they want to profitable for themselves, but they never built that land back up. There was never an American entrepreneur from that neighborhood who said, you know, I see this building and I want to start a factory here. I want to start a factory. It was never made possible, right? So while they're preventing, so the church, right? Let me stick the church. So the church lost a lot of influence and power when the Europeans murdered Dr. Martin Luther King. And the Muslims in America lost a lot of power and influence when they murdered Malcolm X. Because Malcolm X had spiritually evolved to the point where he understood that all people are people, that race means nothing, that even though the Europeans in America, Detroit, where he came from, were brutally murdering and killing his people and using setups and social institutions formed from a basis of blood libel to create labyrinthine mazes that would only end up in the destruction of the Black people. Malcolm X realized all of that. And his autobiography is still it's still the best-selling autobiography in colleges and universities, according to Genesis, the Google AI, the autobiography of Malcolm X. And when I studied it in graduate school, what we were taught by our Europeans was that the reason why Malcolm X's book is so important is because he forgave European people and he was not militant, Black militant. So he was the sign of the end of Black militancy. Even though they'd already murdered Fred Hampton, they'd already compromised Eldridge Cleaver and Catherine Cleaver. They'd already put, oh man, in Chicago, they murdered Fred Hampton and his girlfriend in bed. They were in bed and the cops came in and just murdered them. And as late as the 1980s, late 1980s, I read a report in the Reader, a privately owned, out of the mainstream alternative newspaper in Chicago and California as well, like LA, San Francisco has the Reader, but Chicago had the Reader too. And they talked about a police district, the Shakespeare district on the north side of Chicago, and how the torture rooms were found, where they would attach electrodes to the genitals of brown and Black men and electrocute them through their genitals. I actually had to go to that precinct once when a European drunk driver ran into my new Celica. It was the second time a European ran into my beautiful car. It was a beautiful Japan made, totally made in Japan. First, second generation Toyota. And it had so much style and great paint job, wonderful handling. I mean, this car was totally superior. This car was the reason why men like Sheldon Epstein and David S. Gutman were interested in invading Japan and compromising their manufacturing industry and forcing Americans to get a piece of it, a piece of their pie. Even after Werner von Braun, Elon Musk bombed them in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Japanese couldn't stop the Europeans from coming in. They couldn't stop David S. Gutman from starting an office there to steal intellectual property from Japan. They couldn't stop him at all. I mean, if that's what he was doing. I don't know if that's what he was doing. I just know that was what Sheldon was doing at Brunswick, and they were partners there and friends there. And when I talked to David Gutman a couple of years ago, he still had a lot of respect and admiration for Sheldon. Still felt like a protege of Sheldon. So I'm only speculating, you know, because European nationalism is a global movement. It's not local. It always amuses me when the Europeans are talking about themselves as if they're different, right? But it starts very close to home, right? I mean, a Scotsman, you can't tell a Scotsman from an Irishman on sight, and you can't tell an Irishman from a Brit on sight, and you can't tell a Brit from a German on sight, and you can't tell a German from a Hollander, from an Amsterdam. What do you call it? The Netherlands, right? And you can't tell a Netherlander from a Belgian. The only people that have some racial distinction are the Spanish, the Italians. You can't even tell the Greeks in many cases from the other Western Europeans, right? And once the Europeans, the Western Europeans invaded Russia, it's hard to tell the Eastern Europeans from the Western Europeans. So when the rest of the world is looking at them, they all look like white people to us. They all look like generic Europeans to us. But to themselves, they have differences that they murder each other over. They have jokes, they have hierarchies, they have everything as if they're different. So they still imagine on the global scene that they seem different to the rest of us. So when a European says, "Oh, I'm Australian," and we see a European, he doesn't understand that we see a European. When a European says, "I'm a Russian," and we see a European, they don't know that we see a European. And they have done everything they could with the blood libel system to present images of themselves as the indigenous people. But the indigenous people of Russia, many of them are still raising reindeer. They're still relying on reindeer as an important part. They're Siberians, they're Mongolians. Those are the real Russians. The real Australians, they're on an extremely tight lockdown because you know how the Europeans in the public broadcasting arena keep telling us that, and Donald Trump keep telling us that the immigrants, the new wave of immigrants, that the homeland countries that they're from emptied out the prisons to get those people to come here and settle in America? Well, that's exactly what they did in Australia. The Australians came from British prisons. So they came there primarily psychopaths. You know, there's a movie called Muriel's Wedding, one of my favorite movies. When I was designing a course in women's film to teach in the universities, I was going to include that one. But in Muriel's Wedding, she's Australian, right? She's a European Australian. And her entire family is immoral. And she steals from her father, you know, and her father abuses her mother horribly till her mother kills herself. And their son is mentally defective, and so's her daughter. And they eat way too much. And all Muriel wants is a wedding. And she robs her father, right? And that's the movie. because they showed a family in such a state of moral decay that if you weren't European, you would know how the rest of the world is judging them and saying, wow, that daughter stole and the father's already a thief, and domestic abuse. And so much of that family was presented as a normal Australian family. And if you think of the descendants of prisoners, dangerous criminals, and think of their descendants, well, those character traits are going to come through the DNA. So you might, and also see Rabbit Proof Fence, which is the movie that actually shows how the British decided to use miscegenation, intermarriage, to create a bastard race that looks European, but has ownership of the land through the bloodline. Okay? And Rabbit Proof Fence is a movie about two real Australian women, girls, three of them, who actually walked away from the school they were forced to be in, much like the Indian schools in America, the ones that the Canadians in a university in Canada have taken under account, much like the ones that Queen Elizabeth is accused of stealing from Vancouver. Schools like that. She's accused of stealing many, many Indigenous American children from a school in Vancouver in somewhat recent times, in the past, 20, 30 years. But just like they had those schools here in America, Indian schools, which were like a plantation, where the Europeans took control of the lives of the children to destroy the family and disrupt the progress of the generations, and make the children not trust their parents, and make the children believe that the Europeans were better because the Europeans beat that into them. And the number of dead bodies that they're finding on the grounds of these schools is a proof of it. But we don't see that in the news, do we? We don't see that when the Europeans are talking about world conditions. No, when the Europeans are talking about world conditions, they talk about themselves in Australia, they talk about themselves in New Zealand, they talk about themselves in Ukraine, they talk about themselves in Russia. They talk only about themselves in the highest display of cultural narcissism that you want to see for yourselves. They don't, when they talk about the problems of America, they talk about the problems of European nationalism in America. And they integrate it, they weave it in with the stories of all the other Europeans. And they present themselves as one people because they know what we see is true, that they are one people with one agenda. And it does not include me and you. It's an agenda for the European control of the assets of the world and the people. And any people that are capable or wanting to fight, well, they're going to be put in a concentration camp. They're going to be killed. They're going to be dissolved. They're going to be isolated. They're going to be deemed insane. They're going to be subjected to day after day of pain and torture. They're going to be treated like the Arabs imprisoned at Guantanamo. Violation of human rights. The church today, we saw a lot of bad press come out over the past, okay? Now, first, my children being taught that the Bible was invented. That undermines Christianity and Christian religion, doesn't it? When you find out that the Bible was created as a political document to control people, and that it was distributed the same way, and that it had enough points that you want to believe in to make you accept it and just deal with the contradictions and the lies in the best way you could manage, right? Because of the goodness and the moral values shared in the Bible. That's why we love the Bible, right? At least the New Testament, right? And in the Old Testament, with all those European genealogies, they also include human truths, right? Much like the Greek myths, which were based on Egyptian stories, and the Greek myths formed the oeuvre, the foundation of the oeuvre for Shakespeare, and Shakespeare's plays were played all around to illiterate people. Just like the wisdom of being human has been passed on through arts and literatures and performance, so it is with the Bible, that it gets passed on. And people don't even read it and understand it sometimes. Because when I was doing my thesis for Yale on the work of my mentor, Leon Forrest, chairman of Northwestern University Black Studies Department, deceased. When I was, in fact, January 5th coming up, no, January 7th will be his birthday, but he's not with us anymore in this sphere. And Leon Forrest used to be the editor of the Messenger, you know, for the Nation of Islam. Before he was a professor, he was an editor for the Messenger, which was the weekly newspaper for the Nation of Islam. Well, when I was doing my thesis for Leon Forrest, I read the book of Genesis for the first time. Now, the Bible, I read a lot, but I could never read the Bible. It was always hard for me to read the Bible. And there was one point in my life where I thought, well, maybe I can't read the Bible because I'm demonic. Maybe you have to be a good Christian, and maybe there's some evil hidden inside me, which, if anybody who knows me from the time I was a child, they would know that that's ridiculous, right? They they would know that that's ridiculous, that I'm evil. Although I do understand that you've got to use evil to defeat evil in the long run. In the long run, you need evil people to fight evil people, because good people are never going to think of the things that evil people will do until those things are done. And then you're looking back and you're saying, oh, they did this and they did that and they did this, but you won't be able to see it coming if you're good, if you're truly good. So the church has been under a lot of negative propaganda. I mean, my children weren't going to go to church and believe in the Bible if their teachers had already taught them that the Bible was a political instrument, even though the Bible has really great advice for communal living in it and really great foreshadowing of the challenges that you're going to face in life as you live. The Bible has so much in it that's worthy and valuable and good, so much mother wit, right? So much intelligence. But when I read the book of Genesis, I did it from this vantage point. And I'm a grown woman. I'm in my 30s in graduate school, trying to read the literature that informed the writing of Leon Forrest. And Leon Forrest must have read everything from every culture that had ever been published, because it took me a long, long time to even get close to catching up to the literary influences of Leon Forrest. But the Bible was a very strong one. Chicago writer, Louisiana, Creole, Louisiana. His father was a Pullman porter, fourth class, I think, which I think means dishwasher, on the Pullman trains. I think his mother was a teacher, something like that. I'm not sure. By the way, Pullman porter was a great job. They made pretty good money. Leon Forrest grew up in a nice apartment in Hyde Park, where he lived as a grown-up for a little while, and before he moved to Evanston to work at Northwestern University. But Leon Forrest is largely ignored when he is a literary giant. But that's another story that I'll tell another time, because this is about the church. When I read the book of Genesis, I went into the endeavor believing that Adam and Eve were the first people ever created. And I used to just get totally in a conundrum trying to figure out, well, if they were the only people, then all of us are the products of incest because they had to mate with each other and their children had to mate with each other. And excuse me, how could that actually work mathematically? And how could they get all the racial diversity? So one of the reasons why it was hard for me to, buy into Christianity is because of questions like that that couldn't be answered. But in my 30s, I finally read the book of Genesis, and I discovered that when Adam and Eve went to mate, they went to other people that had already existed, that there were already other races, tribes, families living when Adam and Eve were created. So Adam and Eve were not the first man and woman. They were not the original man and woman. Unless, of course, you believe that only one race has men and women and that every other race is composed of animals, right? So if you've got Adam and Eve and you say this is the first man and woman, and then you spend thousands of pages talking about somebody, the son of somebody, the son of somebody, the son, you just pages of genealogy, then you are trying to say, well, these are the human beings and everybody else is an animal. Okay. But then they mated with the animals to expand the people, right? They had a family. They had Cain and Abel who murdered one brother, murdered the other. What kind of religious place is that to begin? What kind of story of good is that to begin? If your first family has children that kill each other, well, they may as well be prisoners out of the prisons of Britain that took over Australia, ready to murder the Australians because they're all psychopaths and they don't have a problem killing innocent human beings. They don't have a problem devaluing human life. Much like John Smith, the head of the Mormons, he was driven out of many churches on the East Coast of America and in the Midwest. He was ridden out on a rail after being tarred and feathered more than once. So, wouldn't it just make sense that the European military forces, the war invaders, they would want him to lead the campaign on the Oregon Trail to murder the Navajo, to murder the Indians, to create artificial droughts by making Lake Mead, to steal and aggregate all the water? Well, those are people who wouldn't care, knowing that people were dying of thirst, knowing that people were dying of cold because you chopped down all the forests, knowing that people were dying of starvation because you made a great big mountain of dead buffalo. Huge mountain of dead buffalo. Did you see that picture? So if you're a psychopath, you're going to enjoy that work. So you're not going to be killed. No, no, no. You're going to be given a castle like Dan Pena, who tried to murder his teacher in elementary school. Dan Pena, who has a goal to buy every trailer park where the poorest Europeans go to live. His goal is to buy every trailer park and privatize it and send the people on their way. Well, you got to be a psychopath to be willing to execute a plan like that, to conceive a plan like that. Look how we can make a whole bunch of money, boys. Look how we can acquire all this land, boys. All we have to do is buy up their land. The lands that they're leasing. Why, I told you before that a European family that had spent 30 years in a trailer park were told that if you move by April, we'll give you $7,000. If you wait till May, you'll only get $4,000. And if you wait longer than that, you're gonna get nothing. All the while knowing that the real estate associations nationally are conspiring in price fixing to make the laws of supply and demand completely irrelevant, to make it so that only the chosen people to participate in the economic system, mostly Europeans and allies of Europeans, they're the only ones that are going to have homes to live in. Everyone else will be homeless and stuck walking on streets that are made like mazes where you can't hide, you can't find a little corner. You can't even find a place to sit in the sunshine or enjoy a nice view because the Europeans took it all and blocked it off and put it behind fences and made it so the only place you can go is the public railroad, is the public way, the public road, right? But King Leopold was the first to make that a success, and that was hundreds, maybe even thousands of years ago, over 1,000 years ago, when he invaded the Congo, when they were invading Central Africa for the gold and the oil and the materials and murdering the people and making the people slaves, conditions that persist to this day. So when we see roadways still being used as weapons of war to control people, to control where human beings can go, control what you can see, that you might make something of for yourself and your family. All of that done, right? Using roads, a war strategy. Now, if you don't know about King Leopold, it's a surprise to you and your generation, right? And if you don't have a place to meet, to congregate, to share information, if all your universities are taken over by Europeans and European allies, and people that want to tell you the truth are excluded and blacklisted and targeted for the rest of their lives, then you're not going to know. And you'll be taken by surprise. And if you're taken by surprise in an ambush, there's no hope for you, right? So, removing the power of the church was a very important step for the Europeans to make in taking over American lands, waters, airspace, minerals, assets, and people. Very important step to make. So, they put it in the public discourse, as blood libel would teach them to do, that you couldn't trust the church, that the leaders of the Catholic Church are pedophiles that have created a lot of misery by raping little boys, that men like Joel Osteen don't talk about Jesus and have a map of Africa on their stage because that's their conquest. That's what they want to conquest. And that if you do come into a Joel Osteen church, you're going to find them to be a vicious gang, and that they've taken over tons of land in downtown Houston, Texas, but they're not charitable. I mean, everybody was shocked when Joel Osteen closed his church during a huge hurricane, and he had nothing but space. It would have been so easy for them to put people in those great big empty foyers and hallways. The Joel Osteen congregation treated me horribly when I went there to visit. When I went there, when I moved to Houston, I couldn't wait to go see Joel Osteen. I mean, I thought I was going to experience so much healing from the torture I had gone through from the gang stalkers in Arizona and the persecutors in the justice system like Tina Ainley. There, I thought, oh man, I thought Joel Osteen, right? And I get there and they really abused me. I mean, they knew who I was and they let me know they knew who I was. And when I was there and I could see the big map of Africa at the center of their stage, it didn't spin. It was on Africa because that's their target. And when I saw all the well-dressed Black and Latino and European people there, well, a very, very tiny part of the Joel Osteen campus was devoted to that church space. Teeny part. They have a full city block of space there. And they could have taken in hurricane victims, but they didn't. So everybody said, well, that's not very Christian. And the faith in the church dropped, right? So you got the pedophiles, faith drops. You got this, faith drops. You got Martin Luther King, faith drops. Faith dropped in the church, and faith dropped in God. You had all of these Germans, Nazis coming over, publicizing the fact that they don't believe in God. You had all of the World War II concentration camp survivors coming over saying, well, we don't believe in Jesus. And you're looking at them and they have so much material success, right? But it's not enough for you to know that the Bible says, the mighty will fall and the most meek and humble will rise. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can only hear that for so long, but you watch one generation after another of your people dying in poverty and misery, victims of European nationalist racism, you start to lose faith yourself. And when you lose your place to congregate, right? You don't have a Rotary Club. You don't have a Lions Club. You don't have an Elks Lodge. You don't have any place to meet to scheme against other people, to scheme on how to protect yourself, to scheme on what the enemy's doing to deprive you and disempower you and disenfranchise you and rob you and kill you. If you don't have any place to share that, then your whole defensive line is stopped. Your whole defensive line is stopped, and your offensive line is non-existent. You got to know who your enemies are. You got to know. And if you can't share intelligence, you can't tell who's on what side. So when I look at the Black church here in India, I decided to go to church because I knew that was one place I could find American Black people. I knew if I could find a Black church, I would find Black people. But I was surprised at how few people are going to church and how hardly any children are involved in church anymore. And I understand it. I didn't send my children to church because Sunday we were just so tired from the week that we didn't want to get up early and get dressed up and trot ourselves out to church for the day. We wanted to do whatever we wanted to on a Sunday. Now, back when my family owned agricultural land and school was taught by ourselves, our people, and women stayed home raising their babies and doing some farming and agriculture and sewing clothes and doing the trading of commodities and creating community organizations. When women's work was domestic work and men's work was working on the land, then you could go to church all day. And church was your chance to get dressed up because you weren't going to the European corporate offices, right? So church had an important social meaning, an important context. But church was also the place where you met and shared intelligence. It's when you heard what happened to Suki's family. It's where you heard who Fanny got married to and what was the result of that. It's where you heard how many children Rita had. It's where you heard that Nellie's sister is in a healing place, healing from an illness. It's where the community developed its intelligence about each other and about what was happening, the threats from outside. So once the Europeans targeted the Black church through the destruction of the civil rights movement, whatever that is, right? And through their public discourse on devaluing belief in God and devaluing the church, and then backing it up by having material success evade the people that loved God. Well, that created a crisis, right? Because not only were people not able to create resistance movements against the ever encroaching genocide and theft, they were losing their faith that God could help them. Okay? Losing your faith that God can help you. That's a devastating loss. That's a devastating loss. Because when you're being persecuted and attacked and genocided and robbed, when you're being prevented from fulfilling even the smallest of your goals for your personal happiness, when you're being prevented from fulfilling the mission that God sent you here to fulfill, losing your faith is losing everything, isn't it? Because underneath all that, you're believing that God can fix all this. God sees it. God knows it's unjust. And it might be taking generations, but God is going to fix it. God is going to make good people winners and make evil people gone. And when you believe that, you're willing to do your piece. You're willing to do Maharati Mukherjee, the East Indian American immigrant novelist who wrote the book Jasmine. I think she's deceased now, but she published the book Jasmine here in America, in the past few decades when she immigrated here. She became an American novelist. And Bharati Mukherjee wrote in her book that Jasmine's father died because he got hit by a bus while carrying a plant across the street. And throughout her life, she was struggling. The main character, Jasmine, Jehoiti was her Indian name, but she changed it to Jasmine in America. During that time that she was struggling, she was saying, "My father died so senselessly in a senseless accident. Why? Why, God? Why?" And it was there that her Hindu and Jain religious philosophical upbringing kicked in and said, "Who knows what my father accomplished when he carried that plant across the street? Who knows what chain of events were fulfilled or set in motion during that one event? And maybe to me it looks insignificant and cruel and senseless, but in the grand scheme of things, in the big picture, there's a purpose behind it. I don't know the purpose, but I have to believe that that purpose exists because I believe in God. I believe our lives have purpose. I believe our lives are orchestrated to a large extent. And that maybe the only thing that we do is carry a plant across the street and die doing it. That action had value. That action has meaning. That action is a fulfillment of purpose. So the belief that we have a reason to be here and that we're not here by ourselves and that there is a divine power acting on our behalf becomes almost necessary, right? I mean, when Nelson Mandela or any of the men from Arab nations who had the power to create a resistance, who were imprisoned by the Europeans in Cuba. Now you tell me that if Cuba's a part of communism and Cuba's a part of Russia, then how come the United States can store prisoners on Cuba? I mean, if Cuba were really enemies and not just constructed and pawns of the Europeans of Russia so that they have a footprint in our country, much like the European nationalists use Israel as a footprint in Arabic countries, the heart of the invasion, the heart of the genocide, the heart of the murder made possible by the UN. And we're supposed to believe that the European nationalists can't stop the Israelis who were put there by the UN for just this purpose. I mean, we remember how many times European presidents of the United States Corporation told us that Israel serves an important foreign relations purpose as an invading force there. Well, now we see what that purpose is. I mean, didn't Donald Trump say in his first candidacy that he wouldn't have asked the Arabs, he would have gone in and taken their stuff? Didn't he say that? And that was back when he was a good guy, in my eyes. And he said something horrible like that and the Keystone Pipeway. Donald Trump had no problems robbing and murdering people for their stuff as the president, right? So Israel, we've always been told, has strategic meaning for the United States of America, and it does for the United States of America Corporation. But I bet if you were to ask one American after another, do you approve of the genocide of Arabs for the theft that the Europeans are conducting to steal their land? Real Americans would say no. So we know we're not in a democracy because we know that the murder going on there has nothing to do with our moral character, but they're doing it using the name that everyone uses to call us, right? And that's why it's so important, the work of people like Brandon Joe Williams and Christopher Hauser, to make it very clear to all of us that the United States of America Corporation is a government. And this government is formed by private profit seeking agencies filled with Europeans. And that governments are designed to rob you of your stuff, including your rights and your humanity. And the Europeans are teaching themselves and us that. So they know it, right? So when we hear that all of the Europeans are just sitting around with all their weapons and all their political power, they're just sitting around watching the Israelis bomb hospitals, murder babies, and that we're just watching. And while we're watching, we're sending billions, gigabillions of dollars to the Europeans in the Ukraine, where the bioweapons are made, where blood libel might have begun, for all we know, where baby killers are okay, like in Belgium. So if the Europeans can't stop Israel, where do they get the power to steal all my stuff? Where do they get the power to steal all the stuff that belongs to the Australians? Where do they get all this power to steal all the stuff that belongs to the Inuit in the Northwest Territory? Where do they get all the power to steal all the stuff that belongs to the different Mongolian, Asiatic tribes of Russia? Suddenly, the Europeans have no power. Suddenly, the Europeans can only watch. I don't believe it, right? But we're supposed to believe that they are Christians. And we are supposed to follow them in the tradition of Christianity. And it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So a lot of people, Americans, left the church because it just didn't make sense. Because we see the people who present themselves as the Christians, the people who present themselves as looking like Jesus Christ, are the most horrible, predatory, murderous, robbing, immoral, blind people on the planet. So a lot of people left the church because of that, because of the hypocrisy in Christianity. But here's what we lost. We lost the ability to congregate. We lost the ability to share intelligence. We lost influencing our children because our children don't come to church. Church for Americans could be such a powerhouse of inspiration, of strength, and of resistance to the genocides that are taking place. But one of the strategies for colonization is to disrupt communication between the generations so that the wisdom of the elders does not get to the young ones, so that the young ones can be blood libeled. They can be convinced that lies are true, that realities, constructed realities, are the major reality. You see, when you don't go to church and meet the great people who have accomplished good things and done so by having continuing faith in God that makes them never give up, when you meet the professionals, the winners, the achievers that actually go to church, then you know that rapper culture is a lie, is a blood libel psyop. because you know that the good people that would go to church were all about uplift, economic success, progress, education, morality, moving forward. But you destroy the church and you replace it with a popular culture that stereotypes your people and then sends out worldwide images and representations of your people as thieves and killers, as stupid and silly and ridiculous and impractical. When they do that, and you have no institution for counterbalance, then just like any seesaw overloaded on one side, you're going to fall off. You're going to fall right off the plank. You're going to walk the plank and fall off. You're going to be captured by the pirates, forced to walk the plank with the point of a sword in your back, and you're going to slide right off and get lost in the ocean, lost at sea. And then you'll be a citizen, right? Because isn't your birth certificate your certificate that you were lost at sea? But as long as people can't share the intelligence to understand what's really happening behind the scene, to see that the Wizard of Oz is just a guy in front of a bunch of scary machine parts, and that the real Wizard of Oz is kind of goofy and willing to fool you to create a better place for himself to exist. Well, they are still destroying the Black church. Here in Indio, they used city government to seize the lands that the churches were on, which devastated the communities, which left only a few places where Blacks could go and meet. Both of the churches I go to, I'd say the median age of the congregants is 70. I'd say we're almost all senior citizens and very few children come in. And I heard that the population of Indio for Black people is only around 3%. But I know that that's because they were driven off. They were driven off. Because this is a wonderful place to live. It's in the desert, plenty of sunshine, lovely mountains, and it's a good place to live. And plenty of water if you know how to get it. But the Europeans have taken the water and funneled it to their golf courses, funneled it to their private communities with waterworks and rivers, and left the indigenous people on the dry, barren sands. They've created plantations for dates where they take a lot of water. So there's plenty of water under the sand here, plenty of water, but not if you're an American, okay? Because that's a part of the war strategy, just like in South Africa. My hope for speaking out is to bring more young people to the church as a place to meet other Black people that are really about being serious in their lives. I've met so many people among the relatively small groupings, so many people I met with stories to tell about their achievements, about their successes, about the way they contributed great things to society. Beautiful people, important people, valuable people, people targeted for genocide. The number of tragic stories about what happened to the children of us, our children, exceeds statistics, because when you're targeted, they're going to take you out. They'll make sure your children die young, medical malpractice, shootings, car accidents. And all these tragedies just made these people more devoted to God because they endured so much pain and misery in their lives that faith in God becomes totally real. One reason why the enemies of America and the Satanists and the European nationalists, one reason why they have not won yet, and they're actually going to have to bring in Elon and Vivek to come up with strategies to destroy us using Starlink and the militarized Starlink. One reason why they weren't able to succeed before was because of our faith in God. Americans have faith in God. Americans believe in morality. It's in our DNA because we never had to fight each other for bread. We had enough. We had abundance until Europeans came and created scarcity and economic laws that they violate themselves. I mean, the law of supply and demand alone should bring down the price of housing and food. But instead, they centralized food production, they centralized food distribution, they even centralized grocery stores so that you have to go to them for everything. And now they're in the midst of stealing and controlling so much water in California, in Arizona, in Nevada, and stealing land from the Americans to do it, and using fences to block off the land. Why? We could make a big dip in the European invasion if we all just got some wire cutters. Pair of wire cutters for every American man and woman so that you can cut down those fences and walk across that public property and find the gold yourself and find the water spring yourself and build your community wherever you want to, like you used to do before they got here. So without the church, we have no place to meet. And there's more to it than that. You see, a lot of people have said, well, there's so many evil people in the church that it may as well be called the Church of Satan. But that's not true. Not totally. Sure, the church will attract witches, and warlocks and spellcasters because they're going to find people there to work with and victims too. But for the most part, the churches have people that love God. The reason why I wanted to go to the church and didn't worry about, being a Christian or not is because I knew that everyone in a Christian church loved God. Whether they loved God through Jesus or some other saint like the Catholics do, however they were loving divinity, at the end of the day, they're loving God. And that's what I do. I love God. I pray to God. I count on God. And do you want to know why I continue to believe in God after all I've seen and been through? Because God works. Believing in God works. Believing in God works, and I have proof. Proof in my own life. Now, you might say to me, well, how can you prove that the outcome was influenced by God? It could have been that outcome if you were an atheist. I will say this to you. I don't believe that's true. When I stopped believing in God, I stopped having a reason to live. When I stopped believing in God, I killed myself. Because what good is living this life if you're only going to be a victim? If there's no greater power than you, a power that loves you, a power that can actually help you undo your enemies? If there's no God, what's the point of living? So I can look up to myself? How can I look up to myself when I'm merely flesh and blood and soul and spirit? I can't beat an equal being that's dedicated to evil. How could I do that? I can't beat my enemies. I need God. I need to believe in God. Now, I hear people, I believe in extraterrestrials too. And I hear a lot of people, talking about multidimensional, interdimensional living, and ETs are included in all that. And I hear them talk about, well, you're God, you're God. If you're God, where are your worshipers? If you're God, where are the people that believe in you and your power to bring a better world about? If you're God, why are you still here living like this if you're God? Why are you suffering if you're God? It just doesn't make any sense to me. There has to be a real God. There has to be. There has to be a real God in my estimation. And if there isn't a real God, I would be creating a real God by my belief. For everyone that says, well, you are God, you're creating your reality. Well, my creation of reality has God at the Godhead. My version of reality has an all knowing, everlasting, supernatural being that sees everything and judges. Yeah. Now I know that evil exists with good, especially in this reality, in this construction. And I actually believe in many ways that the purpose of this reality that we've been living in was to test good and evil as concepts. Test what happens when you pit a good man against an evil man. Who wins? What happens when you do it generation after generation for billions of years? What's the end result? And we all know that now, right? Evil always wins. Evil always wins. Good never wins. Now, if I were God and I had done this test on humanity, and I had come to the conclusion, well, evil's always going to win. Look at what happened to Silver Rain Runningcloud, a woman of God, an heir of America. Look what evil did to her. Look what evil can achieve. Look how helpless she was to stop it because she couldn't anticipate what evil would be willing to do for economic, social power. Look what evil is willing to do. Look what evil is willing to sacrifice. Well, if I were God, and these were the end days where the experiment was ending, and I was looking at the conclusions and evaluating the data, my conclusion would be that evil is always going to win. And that would be the end of the game. Because with that data, I would have to decide, how much do I value good? Because given enough time, good will be totally destroyed by evil, and there will be no good. There'll only be evil. And once evil's destroyed all the good, evil will turn on itself like a snake eating its own tail. And before you know it, there will be nothing left but the head of a snake that's digesting itself. So the only outcome for a world with good and evil in it is the destruction of good. And that's pretty much where we are now. We're seeing good people being destroyed, good people being disempowered. I've seen articles in news magazines for business people that actually promoted psychopathy in business, actually said psychopaths make the best business leaders because of their ruthlessness. They don't care about the price of human suffering. They just care about the profit and the power to make it so. So if I were God and I were looking at people, and I were looking at people like me, Silver Rain Runningcloud, people like me who are saying, God, if this is going to be your existence, count me out. I don't want any part of this. Look what they've done to me. This is not fun. If you love me at all, God, you've got to do something about evil. Well, if I were God and I had all the good people praying a prayer like that, and it was always my intention to just run the test, right? What do you think I would do if you were God and you created this world as a test for good and evil and the test was over? What would you do? Would you put evil into everlasting light? Or would you put good that refuses to tolerate evil into everlasting light? Or would you do a mix, a yin and yang, black and white, circular design where you keep the balance between good and evil going on? Well, we listen to people tell us that all these realities exist. Well, that's just fine, but the one I want is the one where evil doesn't exist. Now, maybe that's naive, but look what evil has done to me, from Sheldon L. Epstein. And this is just in my adulthood. This isn't talking about what they did to the environment of my childhood. From Sheldon L. Epstein to Henry Louis Gates Jr., I've had evil acting in my life. From Tina Ainley to the judges in Chicago to Judge Butner in Oklahoma, I've had evil change the course of my life. From my brother Andre Martin to petty Illinois state rep in the Illinois state government, from the Nevada state government and the Arizona state government and the Oklahoma state government, from all the state governments that have worked to deprive me of my inheritances, I've seen what evil can do. Greed, evil, the willingness to see somebody's entire family line die while you steal their stuff and profit from it and act like you earned it and you deserved it and you're superior. Superior at what? I don't want to be superior at robbing and killing and acting like there's nothing wrong with that. You rob and kill enough and there's nobody left. And once they took the church out, well, the church is a place where you can be guaranteed to meet people that have faith and held on to their faith and renew their faith, and people that love God and people that believe in God and people that are willing to get up on Sunday morning and go to the same place to reinforce all of that intelligence, all of it. When the evil ones destroyed church, although they brought church, church became the heart of congregations. There was no longer a longhouse in the tribe for the people to meet. There was no longer a sweat lodge. There was no longer women sitting at their breakfast tables gossiping. All of that gone, all of the wisdom, all of the transmitting of protection, intelligence for protection, all of it destroyed. They used the corporate America and the economic system to take the women out of the house and out of the center of the community and the wholesomeness. They removed them. They put in pop culture, television, where you get to watch a show like Married with Children with a lazy, ball scratching European and a whorish wife and two exploitative, stupid children, one of which is a child whore. And we're supposed to watch that and think that's funny. Or we can watch a cartoon, South Park, that reinforces hatred of Jews and hatred of blacks and talks about the devil as if he's a hero and a cool guy. All these things in the public space. And let us not forget rap music. Let us not forget that, making all those ignorant people rich and making sure that the intelligent people stayed poor and struggling and unknown. And the ones that became rich still don't get in the public face. I mean, they made sure to destroy Ebony and Jet, Johnson publications that highlighted the positive, uplifting, grow forward achievements of real Americans, giving them some rewards, public recognition. We all want public recognition for our achievements. That's why we have commencement exercises. That's why we have church pageants, church choirs, because we all want to be seen by each other. We all want to be recognized. We all want to be admired. And we all want to be kept on the right track. So when they put rap music out and the women of Spelman College said, hey, no, that's not us. Get rid of it. That's not us. What did the enemies of America do? What did the Satanists do? They gave us more of it. And before you knew it, the beautiful ballads of Motown, singing about love and devotion and the sacrifices of our mothers, gone. And instead, we hear about gin and juice and twerking. Instead, we hear about, I got a lot of problems, but a bitch ain't one. All of a sudden, we're all bitches and we're cool with it because it's slang, right? And we want to be cool. We want to be contemporary. We want to be in the public space like we're contemporary. So we go for it. We refer to ourselves as bitches. And I don't see a whole lot of problem with that. As long as we know we're women. And as long as we are honored and respected as women. As long as we are obeyed as mothers. Because aren't mothers the first leaders that we meet in our lives? Isn't the space of motherhood somewhat sacrosanct? But we're looking at a world that says, well, no abortion because we just respect children's lives and mothers so much. What they're really saying is if there are no people, there are no subjects for our monarchies. If there are no people, there are no slaves. If there are no people, there are no people to hurt. And it's really easy to hurt children who are born when their parents can't afford them in any kind of way. So they want to force the children to be born so that their children can be absorbed into a system of heartless ruthlessness, because without good people, there is no reason to be evil. So there's no reason for the existence of evil if there's no one to victimize. Once you're just left with the head of the snake, there's no one else to look at. There's nothing else to eat. There's nothing else to consume. There's nothing else to destroy. All you have is eyes and a mouth and a tongue and a brain. But everything that used to be around you is gone. So getting past the rhetoric, getting past the blood libel mind trips is the biggest challenge, right? Right now, we're watching Israel murder people, and we all know that it's immoral. We all know it's genocide, and we all know it's for the riches of Arab lands. We all know that. And we also all know that there's not a doggone thing we can do about it. Nothing we can do about it, because the European nationalists tied our hands before they began that invasion. They had the proof that we were helpless when they had COVID make everybody stay home. But do you want to know the real reason everybody stayed home? Because they were so tired of working for the corporations and getting nothing, and seeing billionaires enjoying everything. They were so tired. They were like Sheldon L. Epstein watching the wasp that didn't even show up to the office because he was in a golf course or in a bar or in a country club with a bar, getting drunk, taking drugs, going on ayahuasca voyages out of his mind, while you're the one showing up for work and towing the line. People were tired. They wanted a reason to just stop. And COVID gave it to them. And that's how you got the complicity of the people in their own oppression. But you also proved that you can make the masses do anything you want to now. The masses are totally pliable now. Israel can start to murder all the Arabs, the people that really look like Jesus can be murdered. And all the people that wish they could do something and know it would be so easy to stop one little bunch of people, they have no power. They have no power at all. And they're watching the Vivek Ramaswamis and the Elon Musks increase the untouchable military power by using space, by taking over space, by claiming space for the Europeans and their allies. So I think I've covered church. I wish so much that young people would come to church. Church gives you a place to renew your faith in God. Church gives you a place to gather community level intelligence. Church gives you a place to get advice and guidance from your elders who have been there and done that and see the train coming. Do you want a seat on the train or do you want to get run over? That's the difference that an elder can bring to your life. Church gives you a chance to perform. If you like to get in front of a mic and do a little talking, well, church will give you that. Do you like to sing? Want to develop your voice? Come to church. You want to hear live music? Maybe learn how to play an organ, a piano, a bass guitar, or a drum set. There are people at church that might be willing to teach you all of that. I wish more than anything that I could bring American people into the American churches. And whatever European infiltrators are there working diligently to undermine the integrity of the American church, they'll be meaningless when you show up in numbers. Now, I'm not going to say that everyone who's European in an American church is an infiltrator. I would just say that if Americans show up at European churches, the Europeans will make it very clear that race is on their mind and that we are not welcome there. So if you know your people are not welcoming, why would you come into our space? Right? Unless it's to carry intelligence off to your people who are always wanting to know what we're thinking. I mean, my friend Emily Schwartz in Phoenix, Arizona, who gave me a very nice Thanksgiving dinner where I even met a client, a man who turned out to become a client in my book publishing business. When I first met Emily Schwartz and we were talking openly about Jews and blacks, and she had adopted 2 black kids, she and her husband. But her husband got strung out on drugs and deserted the family. And they used to be in New York, but they lost their business in some, well, they lost their business. And Emily Schwartz was living on public aid, and they hooked her up with group therapy and benefits and reduced rents. And one of her children was still living with her. And this girl looks black, right? But I'm trying to befriend her. I'm trying to give her work. I'm trying to develop skills in her. And she's completely not interested at all. And her mother, her foster mother, her adopted mother, grew her up in a horrible neighborhood called Cave Creek, Arizona. Very brutally racist. Now, her black son that she adopted won't talk to her at all. He despises her because he understands what happened to him. But her daughter, she has no work skills. And I think she's hanging around for the inheritances. but she could be the maid. She could be the live-in lover. I'm just telling you the truth of it. But Emily, so that's why she wanted to talk about race with me, because she has adopted Black children, mixed race Black children. And she's talking to me and she tells me, well, I always subscribe to Push, on Facebook. I guess Push is some kind of organization that creates intelligence about how to survive European nationalist racism and exposes some of the atrocities of the European nationalist racists that's directed towards a Black audience in social media. And I was saying, well, why do you do that? Why do you do that? And she said, because we have to know what you're doing. And I couldn't believe that she said it, but Emily's not that bright. And she actually told me that she perceives herself as an infiltrator, as a spy, keeping track of what Americans are thinking and doing so that her team can undermine any progress. She admitted it. And I said, well, we're not allowed into your public spaces. And she made it clear, because you're not entitled to know what we're doing. We're the master race. We get to know everything. You get to know what we tell you. And Emily made that so clear to me, right to my face. And I think that when you get information from insiders, anthropological insiders, informers, that you've got very good information. So I know for a fact that the Europeans keep their private spaces private and exclusive, but they infiltrate everybody else's so that they can always know, are you getting close? Do you know what we're doing? Are you starting to suspect? Because that's how they know who to target, right? I got targeted because I got right up in their faces at the Skull and Bones of Yale, right? I put myself there, not knowing, because we didn't know about all that stuff back then in the 90s. We didn't know about that. We believed what they presented, which was the best side, that we were all Americans, that we all had a right, that we all love God, that we all want to be good. We didn't see ourselves as a nation of indigenous people being invaded by foreigners who have very few resources, that use the resources of other nations to destroy other nations and other people, and do it systematically and universally. And they're all in on it. Because when they have conversations, they only talk about themselves. When the Europeans talk about the state of affairs in America, they don't talk about me being robbed by officials. They don't talk about my lost inheritance. They don't talk about the destruction of my church or the infiltration by enemies. And for the people in those churches, if you're hearing me and you know me, please know that I care about you. I'm not like you, but it doesn't mean that I can't see you for what you are. I'm not a snake, but I can see a snake and identify a snake when I see one. I'm not a crocodile, but I can see a crocodile and identify a crocodile when I see one. I'm not a tiger, a man-eating tiger. But if I see a tiger, I know I see a tiger and I know how to react. But tigers are beautiful. Crocodiles are beautiful. Whatever the first thing I said, it's beautiful too, right? Life is beautiful. But it doesn't mean that some life isn't dangerous. And I have the right to identify life that's dangerous, even when it's planted in my environment. So it's not that I don't love the people and I feel terrible because I'm a good human being. So I actually feel terrible for sharing this intelligence. That sometimes your enemies are close to you, not because they love you, but because they're spying on you. And I don't want to show up to church on Sunday and find the Europeans not there because of what I said about them, because I don't know what's in their hearts. I don't know. Well, I do know for the one that looked at me with the boiled eye eggs, what was in her heart came out like fire through her eyes. But the other one there, I don't know what's in his heart. I don't know who he really is, right? I don't know why he's there. And at the first church I went to, I know that European is a horrible person, mean and cruel. I know that she holds the church back and is not willing to do the work that needs to be done that she's supposed to do. I know that she's a destructive force, but that church used to be run by a European. A European actually was the pastor of that black church. So that black church needs people, clean, decent American people to survive. But the whole town of Indio is working to eliminate the black community, and compromising the black church is just one way they do it. Getting rid of the places where the Americans can meet, the Indians. You know, I went to an Indian powwow at the Morongo Casino, which is supposed to be an Indian casino, and the whole powwow was outside. Nothing took place inside the casino that had to do with the powwow. No singers appeared in the concert venue. And it just reminded me of the casino on the Pima Reservation, where the Indians, the real Americans, were forced to be outside while the Europeans were inside the grand performance space playing rock. So my Indian people face it too. Now, I'm an Indian, but I'm East Coast, and they infiltrated us hundreds of years ago and destroyed our cultural foundation hundreds of years ago. And it's only through listening to the historians online, who I've mentioned before, two in particular. And it's only through listening to the historians online who tell the real history of America and how real Americans look like me and you. They're brown, they're black, okay? They're even yellow. You've seen how many prairie Americans look Asiatic, look like Koreans or Chinese? And if you go to Utah, you will see ruins in Asian architectural styles. You'll even see a Buddha that's thousands of years old under erosion. You'll see all of that if you go there. But there's another possibility about those Asian ruins in Nevada and Utah and Arizona. It could be that the Asian people were actually living there and the Europeans came and bombed them and killed them and murdered them. There are a lot of bomb testing sites out there, and there could have been people there before there were bombs. It could have been a private genocide out there for all I know, because it's amazing to me that a giant Buddha that's obviously suffering from erosion, excuse me, in the ruins of an Arizona town with Asian type roofs. It's hard for me to believe that that was there thousands of years ago and not sooner than that. But maybe people always feel that way when they see ancient ruins. You're always surprised that anything still exists. But you won't learn in school about these ancient ruins, and you won't see promoted the Asian character of it, because that would be in conflict with the European discourse that they use in the blood libel system to make people think they're not entitled to their own stuff. They're not entitled to their own culture. They didn't even have an own culture. In fact, y'all didn't even exist until we brought you here. So you owe everything to us. And here's our Jesus. You owe everything to our Jesus. So get on your knees and worship the Europeans, because we put ourselves in the God space. We put ourselves and told you about it. And it couldn't happen in one generation because the first generation would say, "Oh, you're a damn lie," right? But you get rid of them and their children, and you put everybody in an institution and you work everybody to the bone in your corporations so they can't think straight, and you drown them with pleasurable sensations through television and radio, and they will forget to try to find out who they really are and where they really come from. And if finding out means you get targeted and have to live in danger and deprivation, well, are you really going to look very far? Or are you just going to hope that the crumbs from the master's table are going to be enough? Silver Rain Running Cloud, over and out. Thank you so much for joining me. I've enjoyed talking to you, and I hope you learned a lot about yourself, about your life, your heritage, and especially help build back the church.